NWA court is in full effect. Judge Dre residing. In the case of NWA versus the police department, prosecuting attorney...
Welcome back, everyone. What we're going to do right now is talk about some of the historical context for the African American readings you did for this week. And before we get going, I'm going to start off by giving you some warnings. So you're going to see some images and some footage that is pretty disturbing in this lecture video. So be prepared for that. And if you maybe think that you can't quite handle it, there's graphic images of racial violence here. If you think maybe you can't handle it, send me an email with some of your concerns and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so I want to start off by actually talking about the song that I used to introduce this lecture. And that is Fuck the Police by NWA. As some of you might have seen the 2016 biopic about the band NWA, and the scene that they have in that movie that inspires the song is the band members standing outside of the studio being harassed by the police and thrown to the ground. Now, in reality, that's not quite what happened. In reality, some of the band members have talked about driving along the highway and shooting other cars with paintballs and being pulled over by the police. And Eazy-E, one of the members of the band, frequently ending up in jail for the weekend. And that is really what inspired Ice Cube to make that video. In fact, he, in his later years, Ice Cube, who wrote the song, sort of scaled back some of what he says in the song and said that they were probably acting like kids who were doing things they shouldn't have. And part of his reason for making those kinds of statements may have been that he wanted to up his image as a family-friendly actor who plays in family-friendly movies. Nonetheless, at the time, in the late 80s, when NWA was recording these songs, they were a different kind of rap group. Some labeled the most dangerous group, the world's most dangerous group. Their music they saw as a way of telling a different kind of story about California, and really telling stories about a different kind of California. On one hand, you have this image of California that you always see on TV, where it is predominantly white people enjoying the sun, women in bikinis, etc. But you have this other part of California, and in this other part of Los Angeles, where there are black communities that exist, and no one was telling those stories. Part of what this group wanted to do was tell the story of that side of LA, particularly the suburb of Compton. And in that area, you had police regularly using excessive force with people who may or may not have committed a crime. They used racial slurs when apprehending black suspects, and oftentimes had very little evidence regarding those suspects. There was a trial that often happened, and those trials were often weighted against black suspects, regardless of whether the evidence was there or not. So many saw the trials themselves that happened as unfair. And in the song, Fuck the Police, that whole thing is reversed. So instead of a black suspect being on trial, it's the white police officers. And they are being tried for their excessive force. And they are eventually sentenced, like convicted and sentenced in the song. The song took on additional meaning in 1991 when Rodney King, a young black man, was beaten after a high-speed chase by police officers. So this is some footage from the beating that was taken by George Holliday. And you can see he's on the ground, and police officers continue to beat him with batons, and kick him. 4 officers were charged with excessive force the following year, and the trial took place with a jury of 10 white people, 1 Latino, and 1 Asian person. So in other words, there were no African Americans on the jury. 3 of the officers were acquitted, which means they were not guilty, and the jury could not decide on the 4th. What ended up happening after these results were announced were widespread riots in Los Angeles. And it was just a few hours after these results were announced. The riots lasted 6 days, 63 people were killed, and just over 2,000 people were injured. More than 12,000 people were arrested. And the unofficial anthem of this riot was "Fuck the Police" by NWA. Initially, many media commentators didn't see race as a major factor in the riots. They didn't understand why race would be the issue. And they often dismissed this as an isolated incident in one city. Of course, there's a much longer history to this kind of violence, and this is the kind of history we're going to get into right now. So, to properly understand, we really have to go back to the end of the Civil War when slavery was ended. And what happened is you have a lot of white people who were used to African Americans only being slaves and only allowed to do certain things, and suddenly those African Americans were free. And that challenged a lot of what white people in the United States thought about themselves and what they could do and what they wanted to do with African Americans. So not long after slavery was abolished, there were black codes. Black codes were laws that limited what African Americans could do, especially former slaves. It restricted their ability to own property, to conduct business, to buy and lease land, to move freely through public spaces, etc. Now, eventually those laws were softened, and they became known as Jim Crow laws, largely because Jim Crow was a character that was associated with black stereotypes at the time. The most common of these laws prevented African Americans from marrying or having romantic relationships with white people. African Americans frequently weren't allowed to testify against a white person in court, and African Americans typically had to have separate schools, separate apartment buildings, separate areas on public transit, and separate health care facilities. These laws were successfully defended as being separate but equal. In other words, lawmakers suggested that we are offering the same services to people who are black. We're just offering them in a different location. But it's not hard to see that from even these images, that the services that were offered to African Americans were substantially less than what was offered to white people. Even when there wasn't a specific government law mandating separation or segregation of people of different races, businesses and institutions had their own rules that they were allowed to enforce. Oftentimes, they forced African Americans to use separate and inferior versions of what patrons enjoyed, and sometimes just banned African Americans altogether. There were also Jim Crow laws that affected Mexicans as well as people from Asian countries. In addition to the larger psychological effect African Americans had because of this segregation, because of the constant reminder that they're separate and lesser, there were economic impacts. They had limited opportunities to succeed. There were only certain types of jobs they could get and certain kinds of places they could live. And because they had no money saved, because they had been slaves and not earning money, there wasn't a chance for them to grow economically or to even set something up for their children. They were limited in terms of the work they could do, the money they could earn, everything. And those laws and even the policies of individual businesses were rigorously enforced by police officers. So it wasn't unusual for a business to call a police officer to have an African American person escorted out of their business, not because they had broken any laws, just because they were breaking the rules of the store. And it wasn't just these kinds of limitations on what an African American could do legally. There was also the constant threat of violence. And this violence largely took the form of lynchings. So the technical definition of a lynching is when a group of people decide to enact punishment on somebody for a perceived crime outside of the legal system. Before the Civil War, lynchings happened to both white and black people. In fact, it was rarely did you have a lynching that was performed on an African American before the Civil War, because, at least in the southern states, slavery was still legal. So slaves were just punished rather than lynched, and white people who say were stealing cattle or were perceived as spies, those were the people that were lynched. But after the Civil War, lynching almost exclusively was performed on African Americans. The popular justification for lynching was that it acted as a deterrent against African American men courting or even raping white women. Now, it's difficult to put together historical data because these kinds of things weren't necessarily recorded in a clear way. However, from what historians are able to put together, the vast majority of lynchings were not about a black man doing something to a white woman. In the vast majority of cases, it's a black man who dared to defend himself against one or more white men who were harassing him. In many cases, the black men were arrested and put in prison, only later to be released from prison where a lynching mob was waiting for him. And then they took him and lynched him. Lynchings were a family event. People got dressed up to go to them and brought all of their family members. It was not unusual for them to pack a picnic lunch and bring it because the lynchings could sometimes last from the afternoon and into the evening. It was not uncommon that police officers, judges, and politicians all participated in these lynchings. In other words, even though it was outside of the law, the people who performed legal services and acted as the law participated in these extra legal lynchings. During lynchings, African Americans were often tortured, hung, and burned. It was not unusual for their genitals to be removed during this process. Again, it was not an activity that the lynch mob was ashamed about or did in secret. Frequently, they posed for photographs like you can see here. And those photographs often became postcards that they could collect as souvenirs. This is a postcard of a lynching of a 17-year-old boy named Jesse Washington in 1916. He was convicted of raping a white woman and was dragged out of the court and lynched. Again, police officers both watched and didn't intervene, and some participated in the lynching. The back of the postcard, you might not be able to read that, says, "This is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is on the left with a cross over it. Your son, Joe." So in other words, this is a son who's decided that this is an appropriate postcard to send his mother and make a joke about it being a barbecue. It wasn't only postcards that people collected as souvenirs. Parts of the lynched body were removed and sold. Oftentimes, people had charred bones that they collected of lynchings. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Michel Foucault and how his theories relate to what we've just been talking about. Now, Foucault doesn't talk so much about the African American context, but another scholar named Robin Wigman makes a lot of comparisons. And so we're going to dig into some of those right now. And the first comparison that needs to be made is on executions. Now, when Foucault talks about executions, he's talking about executions that happened when there was a king. So any crime that was committed, regardless of how big or how small, was considered a crime against the king. And many of those crimes came with capital punishment as the punishment. In other words, an execution. And these executions were generally performed in public. The king himself was not there. Instead, the executioners stood in as a representative of the king to perform the execution, to perform the punishment. And of course, you had the condemned person who had committed this crime against the king and was being punished. And then you had the crowd. Now, what Foucault is most interested in is the way the sympathies of the crowd can shift the power dynamics of these public executions. And so he looks specifically at a number of occasions in recorded history where the crowd begins to sympathize with the condemned person as opposed to the executioner or the king. And what happens in these instances is sometimes they storm the stage and rescue the condemned person and whisk him or her away. In other words, there is always the potential in these public executions that things will dramatically turn depending on how the sympathies of the crowd lie. Admittedly, this didn't happen very often, but it did happen sometimes. There's not the same opportunity for that to happen during a lynching, and the reason is the king, the executioner, and the crowd are all condensed into the lynch mob. And the condemned person is condemned primarily because of the differences between them and the lynch mob, specifically in terms of race. So there's less opportunity for the crowd to suddenly turn on the executioner, in other words, itself, because it sympathizes with the condemned person. This, by the way, is 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was lynched in 1955 because he allegedly offended a white woman in her store. Now, there's some dispute on what he actually did to offend her. She claimed it was a sexual comment. Others claimed it was just that he was not polite enough. In either case, he was killed for it. Now, it's not just executions in themselves. It's the way movement is controlled. For Foucault, when you control a person's movement, you control part of their lives and part of the way they move through the world. So, for African Americans, this is very clear. When you have Jim Crow laws that tell you you can only sit in these places, you can only drink from these water fountains, you can only take up this part of the bus, you're controlling movement that signals the fact that they are lesser. Whereas white people that they see around them all the time are able to go anywhere. It establishes the kind of power dynamic between African Americans and white people. There's also something that Foucault talks about in terms of normalization. So execution is like a punishment and when you have a public execution, it acts as kind of a deterrent. When you control movement, it's something that you enact on somebody's body, but normalization is more psychological. And there's a couple of ways that it works. One is through things like tests. So if I continually give you a test and reward people with good grades who do well in the test and punish people with bad grades who do not do well in the tests, you start to internalize the idea that what is normal and good is getting good marks on the tests. So you condition yourself, in some cases anyway, to answer the way that will get you the good marks because that is what you are convinced is good. And you internalize the idea that that is good. It also happens in culture generally, not just in those sort of school settings. In culture generally, certain things are celebrated and certain things are condemned. Even if you watch the news, the way the news is talked about, certain acts are celebrated and praised, other acts are condemned and critiqued. Once you see that enough, you start to internalize those ideas about what is good and normal and what is not. The problem in the case of African Americans during the time period we're looking at in particular is that what is presented through culture as normal and good and celebrated is white skin. So what happens to a person when you're constantly bombarded with these cultural messages that celebrate a certain skin color as normal and good, something that you can never achieve? So you internalize the idea that you are always somehow lesser because of your skin color. This leads to what some scholars have called a double consciousness. Now, many African American scholars have written about this, but one in particular, at the turn of the century, at the beginning of the 1900s, was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois writes, in this particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. So what Du Bois is trying to capture there is the way African Americans internalize the way white people see them and the way white culture portrays them. So even though part of them wants to celebrate and have pride in who they are and their heritage, they have also internalized this outside view, the way white people see them and the way white culture portrays them. And so those two ideas about themselves are inside always, and they never fully escape the one that is critiquing them and always putting them down. Finally, surveillance. Surveillance is a major part of Foucault's theory. And the way it works, I'll give you two examples. The way it works is if you feel like you might be watched, you are more likely to control your behavior in a certain way. So for example, if you go into a store and you see a security camera there, you are more likely to control and limit your behavior because you know that you're being watched by a security camera, and that even if somebody isn't right now looking at it, they might be able to look at it later. Similarly, if you know that your instructor can go onto Canvas and see which pages you have accessed and which videos you have watched and how long you have spent watching them, you might be inclined to watch the full lecture video that is posted each and every time. For African Americans, this surveillance is different. And this surveillance comes by being aware that white people are watching you and what you do. And it comes in conjunction with everything we've just talked about. So there are controlled movements. Your movement is controlled and you're aware of that, and you cautiously move throughout. And you're aware of white people watching you, waiting for you to make a mistake, knowing that the consequences of those mistakes might be a lynching. And so that impacts the way you move, even if those white people don't explicitly do anything. This is James Baldwin, and you're reading an essay by James Baldwin, but he talks about this the impact of the white gaze, this surveillance of white people on African Americans in his first novel that was published in 1952. In this scene, you have a black man going to meet his son in the city. White men stood in groups of half a dozen. As he passed, each group silence fell. And they watched him insolently, itching to kill. But he said nothing. Bowing his head, he walked, held by his caution, more rigid than an arrow. And then later on, when he actually meets his son, it seemed for a moment as they, that's him and his son, stood there, that death and destruction rushed toward them. Two black men alone in a dark and silent town where white men prowled like lions. So here you can see that these black men are constantly aware that danger is all around them, and that danger solidifies in the gaze of the white men themselves, these groups of white men. And so it causes them to walk more carefully and to be more cautious about those actions. So all of those things are in play with African Americans during this time period. Now, lynchings didn't last forever. Eventually, the federal government decided that lynchings essentially usurped their authority. In other words, it wasn't because they were upset about racial injustice. It was that they were upset that somebody was doing a workaround of their authority. That instead of following rules and laws that acknowledged the authority of the federal government, people were taking the law into their own hands. And so they started to crack down on lynching. But if you remember, the people who were involved in these lynchings, who were conducting the lynchings, were police officers, lawyers, judges, government officials, all the kind of people who were involved in the legal process to begin with. And so what historian James Clark has noticed is that as lynchings declined, executions of black men went up. In other words, the people who were conducting the lynchings in the first place realized that they couldn't kill these black men outside of the law. And so they started to find ways to kill them inside of the law. So it's notorious for black men to be sentenced with the most harshest penalty possible on very flimsy evidence, as compared to white men in particular, who were given lighter sentences often and had a more rigorous level of evidence that had to be presented to show that they had actually committed the crime. You also have the effect of the white gaze, the dangerous white gaze, moving away from just groups of white people in general and being solidified in the police officer. Because now it was the police officer who was not only given the power to arrest and conduct the law, the police officer now had physical power to subdue black men under a variety of circumstances. So it was not unusual for police officers to use excessive force when dealing with black suspects. And it wasn't just black suspects who might have committed a crime, it was demonstrators and protesters. So during the Civil Rights Movement, which roughly, as we said, began in the 50s and moved on into the late 60s, there were a number of different kind of demonstrators and protesters. Some were violent and some were non-violent. And it didn't matter to police which one you were. They used batons to beat demonstrators, they used fire hoses to blow them down, and they used dogs to attack them. Now, there were some successes in the Civil Rights Movement, but with each success, local governments found a workaround and a way to deal with it. In other words, they wanted to continue their racist practices in spite of the federal laws that were put in place. The first federal law that was put in place after the end of slavery was the 15th Amendment, which came in 1870. And this amendment suggested that no state or federal government could restrict voting practices based on race, ethnicity, or prior servitude. So in other words, it explicitly made it mandatory that slaves would have the right to vote. Now, what local governments did instead, as a workaround, was institute policies that disadvantaged former slaves and African Americans. So here's a couple of examples. In one state, or in several states, there were poll taxes. In other words, you had to pay a fee to be able to vote. But there was an exception. If you had voted in the previous election, or your father had voted in the previous election, you did not have to pay the toll. What this essentially meant is that all of those white families that had participated in the election process in the past were able to vote without paying the tax. And all of the former slaves and their families who were not able to vote in the previous election now had to pay a tax. And because their financial resources were very slim, it stood as a very serious discouragement for those former slaves to be able to vote. The other kind of practice that was present was literacy tests. These happened in Missouri, for example. Missouri was not the only state, but let's take Missouri, for example. In order to vote in Missouri during this time period, you had to be able to read a part of the Missouri Constitution and then explain it back to the poll officer so that the poll officer was satisfied that you could actually read and understand what you were reading. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried to read a legal document, but they are extremely complex. And so to be able to expect anyone to be able to read a part of the Constitution and explain it is difficult. I'm not sure that I could read any kind of constitution, whether it be the Constitution of Canada or a constitution of an individual province, and explain every single part of it back to you in a way that made sense. And I have spent most of my life studying language. In addition to that, it was not applied equally to everyone. If there was a white voter, they were often given a very easy part of the Constitution that was very straightforward and simple. And if it were an African American, they were often given a much more difficult part of the Constitution. And even if that African American were able to read that part of the Constitution and fully and clearly explain it back to the poll officer, unfortunately, the poll officer could simply decide, no, you've got it wrong, you aren't allowed to vote. And that happened frequently. So we're going to jump ahead quite a bit to 1954. In 1954, there was a court case, Brown versus the Board of Education. And what this court case essentially decided is that schools that were designed for African Americans were not equal to schools that were designed for white students. There was a dramatic difference in terms of the resources they had available and the education they were provided with. And so the ruling decided that schools could no longer be segregated. In fact, it mandated that all white schools had to become integrated as quickly as possible. The phrase they actually used was with all deliberate speed. And so there were individual cases where black students were bussed into white schools, and that started to happen with more regularity. Some states, however, and some counties decided that they would try and resist as much as possible. And the way they resisted this movement was to suggest that there were too many practical difficulties in having black students come to white schools. The busing was a problem, the timing was a problem, any of these kinds of excuses. And because the law or the court decision itself did not have any plan for these counties, did not have anything they needed to follow, or even a deadline, these counties and states felt like they could push things off as long as possible. Now, universities didn't have to have those kinds of policies. They had other workarounds. So this is Clennon King. And in 1958, he tried to enroll in the University of Mississippi. There was no law against it, after all, especially after Brown versus the Board of Education. He was pulled over by highway patrol officers and committed to a state mental institution because, quote, any black man that tried to attend Ole Miss was obviously crazy. They would only release him once he decided to leave the state for good, effectively ending his bid to attend the school. This is Clyde Kennard. Kennard applied for admission to Mississippi Southern University, and he was urged to withdraw his application because he was black. When he refused, he was charged by police for stealing $25 worth of chicken feed, an event that allegedly happened quite a while ago, like quite a long time before he actually applied to the university. Now, initially, convicted felons are not allowed to attend a state college, so that automatically took him out of the running if he was convicted. He was convicted. Not only could he not attend college, but he was sentenced to 7 years in prison for stealing $25 worth of chicken feed. While in prison, he was denied medical treatment despite the fact that he had been diagnosed with cancer. And so what ended up happening is he died in prison in 1963. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act came into effect. Now, the Civil Rights Act was a major victory for the civil rights movement, even though it did not end racism or institute racial equality. What the Civil Rights Act did was deny federal funding to any institution that was segregated. So if an institution had separate areas for whites and blacks, if it denied services to African Americans, it was no longer going to receive funding from the federal government. Not only that, but the Attorney General would bring out forth lawsuits against those institutions to recover federal money and to make sure that they were conforming to federal law. In other words, it wasn't just an act saying that you're not allowed to do this. It had enforcement measures in place. There were also rules around voting, but there were lots of loopholes that were left open. In other words, it was initially tried to take away some of those restrictions that negatively impacted African American voters, but they weren't as strong as some of these other policies. So in 1965, there was the Voters' Rights Act. And this closed some of the loopholes from the Civil Rights Act. It essentially said that no legislation could unfairly disadvantage any racial or language minority. It banned literacy tests and poll taxes, and certain jurisdictions that had been guilty of using those literacy tests to discourage African American voters were unable to change their voting rules unless they went to the federal government to have those changes approved. Now, those restrictions were removed very recently, and as soon as they were, Republicans, in particular, began changing voting laws and also reorganizing voting areas to disadvantage African American voters and minority voters. So there are several different figures during this period from the 50s and 60s that stand out as ways of responding to racial injustice. And the most notable, probably the one that you've heard of before, is Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach was essentially hate the racism, not the racist. His idea was that you could conquer racial hate through mutual love, and that once you achieved mutual love of all people, white and black people could live in harmony together. He also preached a kind of non-violent protest or non-violent demonstration. So even when police officers attacked demonstrators who followed Martin Luther King Jr., they did not fight back. They simply submitted. One thing that they did that's sort of a passive resistance is go limp, so that police officers had to drag bodies into trucks and take them off to jail. This is Malcolm X, and his approach is quite different. Whereas Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach is very influenced by his Christianity, Malcolm X is influenced by his Muslim faith. He was a member of the Nation of Islam for a while, which is a Muslim group that caters to African Americans in particular. His approach was not to encourage or strive for integration. He wanted a separate area where African Americans could rule themselves, where the politicians were African Americans, the business owners were African Americans, they could make their own rules for themselves, and they could make money and investments for themselves. His idea was that because of the long history of racist policies in the United States, full integration would never happen. And so black people needed to have their own space to be able to grow themselves. His approach to protest and violence was also different from Martin Luther King Jr.'s. His approach was, if a police officer attacks you with violence, you respond with violence. You don't necessarily initiate a violent conflict, but if someone approaches you with violence, don't just take it. Fight back. And the final figure that comes a little bit later than the previous two is Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael is associated with the Black Power movement. The Black Power movement existed while both Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were still alive, but after they were both assassinated, the Black Power movement really started to take off. And the Black Power movement was also fighting for a separate area for African Americans to live, like Malcolm X. But whereas Malcolm X had demonstrations and only responded to violence with violence, Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement advocated initiating violence in order to promote their cause and come closer to getting what they wanted. So let's have a look at the timeline so we get a good sense of what racial injustice looks like in the United States. The first African slave comes in 1619, and as you see, slavery doesn't fully end in the United States until 1865. So that is already quite a long period where people were treated as slaves. In 1780, you have the first anti-slavery law in the United States. A number of northern states began to outlaw slavery long before the southern states, and that, of course, led to the Civil War in the United States, which the North won, leading to the Emancipation Proclamation that outlawed slavery. Now, as you can see, during this period, lynching starts to happen a lot more to African Americans. It happened in northern states as they outlawed slavery, because even though northern states government officials in northern states outlawed slavery, some people in northern states still wanted slavery and still had racist ideas. When slavery was outlawed across the country, you see a real spike in lynching. And as that tapers off, executions become more popular. The other thing you have in that replaces slavery is segregation. And this is where African Americans are treated separately and differently and lesser than white people across the country. So beginning in 1954, with the case that we talked about earlier, Brown versus the Board of Education, segregation starts to die down until 1965, when it is eliminated completely, at least officially. There are still some charges of unofficial segregation happening, but when it is discovered, it is often prosecuted and people are sued. So executions start to go down primarily because a number of states outlaw capital punishment. In other words, they don't execute prisoners anymore. There are still some states that do execute prisoners, but not as many as, say, in the 1920s. The other side of that, the MI that you see, is mass incarceration. So that is where a lot of particularly black men, but African Americans in general, are imprisoned. And where that really starts to take off is the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan has a very strong anti-drug campaign. Now, as many critics have pointed out, this anti-drug campaign unfairly targeted African Americans. And here's just one way that happened. If you are caught with powdered cocaine, which is tended to be used by rich white people, then your penalty or your prison sentence was much lower than if you were caught with crack cocaine, which is just a different form of the same drug. But the thing is, crack cocaine tended to be used by poor African Americans more often. Not only is there that clear in stone difference that favored one race over another, when people were tried and it came to sentencing, statistics suggest that African Americans often have a much longer sentence for the same kind of crime as compared to white criminals. So in other words, they got longer sentences. In addition to this, when you are a criminal in the United States and when you have a prison record, that changes your life completely even after you leave prison, not just because of the psychological damage, but because of the opportunities that are there for you. You can't get the same kind of jobs, you can't get the same kind of loans, you can't vote, etc. So, we have a situation where there were a lot more black men in prison than white men in prison. And that is despite the fact that African Americans make up a significantly lower portion of the population in the United States. And then finally, in 2012, you see the initials TM, and that stands for Trayvon Martin. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old boy who was shot and killed in 2012 by George Zimmerman. Zimmerman was not a police officer, but he was acting as part of the neighborhood watch. And he said he felt threatened by Martin, even though Martin was trying to get away from this man, and Zimmerman was chasing him. At the time, Zimmerman was not charged, but there began a public outcry for Zimmerman to be charged because he had shot an unarmed black man who was trying to get away. Zimmerman was eventually charged 2 months later after the public campaign, but eventually acquitted on grounds of self-defense. So this acquittal led to numerous protests, not just in the city where Trayvon Martin was killed, but across the country. And it gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement that we can see growing today, especially given the events early in 2020. At the time, the president was Barack Obama, and he felt he needed to respond to the way people were reacting to the death of Trayvon Martin. And here's what he had to say.
You know, when Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away.
So it is interesting to see the way different presidents react to similar kinds of demonstrations, even if they are on a larger scale. But why I played this clip and why I think it is important to consider is that when you are examining and evaluating the response of African Americans to these kinds of events, you need to understand that it is not an isolated incident, that it is a long history that happens. Malcolm X once said that racism is like Cadillacs. Every year there's a new model. And each time racism adapts and evolves, it still disadvantages African Americans. And it disadvantages them in ways that threatens their lives. So, when you see Black Lives Matter protesters chanting things like pigs in a blanket, fry 'em like bacon, a vague threat against police officers. And when you have NWA singing a song like fuck the police, or when Malcolm X threatens violence against police officers if they sick their dogs on protesters, or when Amiri Baraka calls for machine gunners to step forward and threatens violence against police officers in his poetry, you can't just evaluate that on its own. You don't necessarily need to support the violent acts that they advocate, but you need to understand all of the things that lead up to this kind of response. Okay, that is all I have for you right now. Have a lovely day.